In America, food has always been more than just fuel. It's comfort, it's culture, it's memory. From soda fountains to school cafeterias, the flavors we grew up with are forever tied to a moment in time. But not every food survived the journey. Some were quietly pulled from shelves. Others were outlawed in shocking bans that left behind outrage, nostalgia, and sometimes relief. Today, we're uncovering 15 banned American foods you'll never taste again. From brightly colored candies of the 1970s, to luxury delicacies that stirred moral outrage, to childhood treats you never knew were illegal. Each one tells a story about the changing rules of safety, culture, and taste in America. Some bans made sense. Others seemed ridiculous. But all of them remind us of a time when our plates, our glasses, and even our candy wrappers carried a piece of history. So sit back, open your memory vault, and let's begin with one of the most infamous drinks of the 2000s, a neon-colored can that blended caffeine, sugar, and alcohol into a chaotic storm. For a brief, wild moment, it was everywhere. And then it was gone. This is the story of Four Loko. If you were in college around 2010, you probably remember the neon cans lined up in dorm rooms, at tailgates, and late-night parties. Four Loko wasn't just a drink, it was a cultural flashpoint, a symbol of youth, rebellion, and a little too much chaos. At the time, Four Loko was marketed as a fruity malt beverage, but what set it apart was its formula. It mixed high amounts of alcohol with caffeine, guarana, and taurine. That combination earned it nicknames like liquid cocaine and blackout in a can. Some states even went as far as comparing it to a drug. Why was it so popular? For starters, it was cheap. A single $2.50 can pack the punch of several beers, plus the energy of a strong coffee. To a generation of college students looking for a quick buzz, it felt like the ultimate party starter. But here's the twist. The drink's popularity also fueled its downfall. Hospitals began reporting alarming cases of alcohol poisoning tied directly to Four Loko. Students were blacking out, some winding up in emergency rooms, and a few tragic cases even made headlines. Suddenly, the drink wasn't just a fad, it was a national controversy. By late 2010, the FDA cracked down, forcing Four Loko to remove caffeine and other stimulants from its formula. The original recipe was banned. Overnight, the wildest drink of the 2000s became a shadow of its former self. For those who lived it, Four Loko wasn't just a drink. It was a time capsule of reckless youth, equal parts fun and fear. And like so many banned American foods, it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Right-ero, but while Four Loko's fall was about health and safety, our next banned food had nothing to do with alcohol or caffeine. In fact, it was a beloved children's candy, outlawed in the U.S. for decades because of what was hiding inside. Imagine a chocolate egg that wasn't just candy, it was also a toy. For children around the world, Kinder Surprise eggs were the ultimate treat, half dessert, half mystery. But in America, this little egg never had a chance. Kinder Surprise eggs, created by the Italian company Ferrero in the 1970s, quickly became a global hit. Each hollow chocolate egg contained a small plastic capsule with a toy inside. It wasn't just about eating candy. It was about the ritual of cracking it open, finding a hidden treasure, and assembling a tiny toy with your own hands. For kids, it was magical. But in the United States, Kinder eggs ran into a problem. A law dating back to 1938, known as the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, banned embedding non-nutritive objects inside food. Regulators feared that small children might accidentally choke on the hidden toy parts. So while kids in Europe, Asia, and Canada grew up with the joy of Kinder eggs, American children only heard about them through stories, or maybe smuggled ones from a traveling relative. The irony? The rest of the world seemed to manage just fine, enjoying Kinder eggs for decades without mass incidents. To American kids, the ban almost gave the candy a mythical status, something you knew existed but couldn't have. Years later, Ferrero introduced Kinder Joy, a US-approved version that separated the toy from the candy. But for many, it wasn't the same. The original Kinder Surprise remains one of the most famous banned candies in American history. It's strange to think that a piece of chocolate with a toy inside could be considered so dangerous. Yet millions around the globe grew up with it as a childhood staple. For Americans, it became one of the great forbidden treats of nostalgia. Right-ero, but while Kinder eggs were banned to protect kids from choking hazards, our next banned food was forbidden for an entirely different reason. Because it came from a duck. For centuries, foie gras has been considered one of the most luxurious foods in the world. Rich, buttery, and decadent. It was the kind of dish you'd find in high-end French restaurants. But in America, this delicacy has also become one of the most controversial foods ever served. Foie gras, which translates to fatty liver in French, is made by force-feeding ducks or geese until their livers enlarge. The result is a silky, melt-in-your-mouth flavor that chefs have prized for generations. For much of the 20th century, foie gras was a rare but celebrated part of fine dining in the United States, a symbol of elegance and European sophistication. But the method of producing it has sparked intense backlash. Animal rights activists argued that the force-feeding process was cruel and inhumane. By the early 2000s, cities like Chicago and entire states like California began pushing for bans. In 2012, California officially outlawed the sale of foie gras, sparking heated debates between chefs, farmers, and animal advocates. Why did it matter so much? To food lovers, foie gras wasn't just another dish. It represented tradition, artistry, and a taste of old-world luxury. But to critics, it became a symbol of unnecessary cruelty. The clash between culture and ethics turned this once-celebrated food into a lightning rod of controversy. Today, foie gras remains banned in California and other places, though it's still available in much of the country. For some, it's an indulgence from a forgotten era. For others, it's a food America was right to leave behind. Right-ero, but not all banned foods came from elite dining rooms. Our next item was once sold in everyday supermarkets across the country, until one ingredient inside turned it into a dangerous fad. Before energy drinks ever hit the shelves, there was one soda that promised exactly what teenagers and college students craved: all the sugar and twice the caffeine. Jolt Cola wasn't just a drink, it was a rebellion in a can. Launched in 1985, Jolt Cola positioned itself as the ultimate alternative to the growing wave of diet sodas and alcoholic drinks. While Coca-Cola and Pepsi were busy promoting light and caffeine-free versions, Jolt leaned into excess. With neon-colored cans and an outrageous slogan, it became the unofficial beverage of late-night study sessions, programmers, gamers, and anyone looking for a turbocharged sugar rush. For a time, Jolt Cola even developed a cult following. College campuses stocked vending machines with it. Computer programmers in Silicon Valley swore by it. Parents and teachers, of course, worried about what was essentially liquid hyperactivity. It became the drink kids weren't supposed to have, which only made them want it more. But the success didn't last forever. As energy drinks like Red Bull and Monster hit the U.S. market in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Jolt Cola quickly lost its edge. Health regulators also weren't too thrilled about its reputation. By the early 2010s, Jolt disappeared from most shelves, remembered only by those who stayed up all night fueled by its jittery buzz. For many, the memory of cracking open a can of Jolt Cola is tied to youth, to staying awake for finals, to all-night gaming marathons, or to simply testing the limits of what your body could handle. It was wild, dangerous, and unforgettable. And maybe that's exactly why it had to disappear. Right-ero, but while Jolt Cola vanished because of its excess, our next banned treat was taken off shelf for a much stranger reason. Because inside every piece of gum was a little spark of fire. Imagine unwrapping a stick of gum that carried the taste of America's early days. A sweet, spicy, root-like flavor that connected you to the past. That was blackjack gum, one of the very first chewing gums in U.S. history. But hidden inside that flavor was something the government would one day decide was too dangerous to chew. Blackjack gum first appeared in the late 1800s, invented by Thomas Adams, a pioneer of modern chewing gum. What made it stand out was its unique flavor: sassafras oil. For many Americans, sassafras wasn't just gum flavoring, it was nostalgia. The same root had been used for centuries in root beer, teas, and old-fashioned candies. The taste was earthy, slightly spicy, and unlike anything else on the shelves. For decades, blackjack gum remained a beloved oddity, a candy that felt both old-fashioned and timeless. It was especially popular with kids who wanted something different from the usual bubblegum or spearmint. Chewing it felt like chewing history itself. But in the 1960s, researchers discovered something shocking. Safrole, the natural compound found in sassafras oil, was linked to liver damage and even cancer in lab animals. Almost overnight, sassafras was banned as a food additive in the United States. And with that ban, Blackjack gum lost its signature flavor. For those who grew up with it, the disappearance of blackjack gum felt like losing a tiny piece of Americana. The gum itself would return with artificial flavoring years later, but the original Sassafras version, the one tied to childhood memories and simpler times, was gone forever. Right-ero, and speaking of childhood memories, our next banned food takes us straight back to school cafeterias, where a once popular lunchroom staple vanished after health officials said it was just too risky. If you grew up in an American school between the 1970s and early 2000s, chances are you remember it: the square pizza. A golden, greasy rectangle with bubbling cheese and a crust that tasted more like cardboard than bread. And yet, somehow, it was pure magic. This cafeteria classic wasn't just food, it was a ritual. Kids lined up in noisy lunchrooms across the country, trading fruit cups and milk cartons just to score an extra slice. The pizza was never perfect, but it was ours. It symbolized Fridays, childhood friendships, and a shared experience of growing up in America. But behind that nostalgic flavor was an ingredient that would eventually be outlawed: partially hydrogenated oils, better known as trans fats. For decades, food companies used trans fats to make processed foods crispier, cheaper, and longer-lasting. That included the very pizza crusts that were shipped frozen to schools across the nation. The problem? Scientists began linking trans fats to heart disease, obesity, and a laundry list of health risks. By the early 2010s, the FDA declared trans fats unsafe, and school cafeterias had to phase them out completely. That meant the square pizzas so many of us remembered vanished or were reformulated into something healthier and, to many kids, less fun. For adults looking back, that school lunch pizza isn't about nutrition or quality. It's about memory, the joy of seeing it on the tray, the taste of melted cheese at a plastic lunch table, and the comfort of being part of a generation that shared the same bite. Losing it wasn't just losing a food, it was losing a small slice of childhood. Right-ero, but if you thought square pizza disappearing was sad, our next banned snack might sting even more, because it was tied to the excitement of opening a pack and finding something more dangerous than sweet. Imagine being a kid and biting into a piece of chocolate, only to find a toy hidden inside. It sounds like pure magic, but in America, that magic was declared illegal. Kinder Surprise eggs, created in Italy in the 1970s, were a worldwide sensation. Each chocolate egg contained a tiny plastic capsule with a surprise toy inside. Often something collectible, sometimes something you had to assemble. For kids, it wasn't just candy, it was an adventure. The joy wasn't only in the chocolate, but in the mystery of what waited inside. In much of the world, Kinder eggs became a childhood staple, but in the United States, they were banned almost immediately. Why? Because U.S. law forbids embedding non-nutritive objects inside food. Regulators feared the toys could pose a choking hazard, especially for younger children. The ban was strict. In fact, customs officers seized thousands of Kinder eggs from travelers over the years, treating them almost like contraband. Still, for many Americans, Kinder eggs became legendary precisely because they were forbidden. Parents told stories of buying them overseas, kids whispered about cousins who smuggled them back from trips to Europe, and for decades, they were a sweet symbol of what the rest of the world got to enjoy. But America didn't. It wasn't until 2017 that a workaround came with the Kinder Joy, a split egg design with the toy packaged on one side and chocolate cream on the other. But for those who remember the original, it never quite captured the same excitement. Sometimes, what makes a childhood treat special is the very thing that makes it dangerous. Right-ero, and speaking of danger, our next banned American food wasn't a toy hidden in candy. It was candy itself, laced with something far stronger than sugar. For generations of American kids, one of the most grown-up feelings came from pretending to be something they weren't: a smoker. And all it took was a stick of sugar. Candy cigarettes first appeared in the early 20th century, and by the 1940s and 50s, they were everywhere. Packaged in little boxes that mimicked real cigarette brands, these chalky sticks of sugar, or sometimes bubblegum wrapped in paper, gave children a chance to imitate the adults they saw on TV, in movies, and even at home. For kids, it wasn't about the candy at all. It was about the performance, the swagger of holding one between your fingers, the puff of smoke when powdered sugar blew off the tip, the giggles when you pretended to be tough in the schoolyard. Candy cigarettes were play-acting adulthood, wrapped in sweet nostalgia. But over time, public health experts began sounding alarms. Studies suggested that kids who ate candy cigarettes were more likely to become smokers later in life. As America's attitude toward tobacco shifted, especially with anti-smoking campaigns in the 1980s and 90s, candy cigarettes were rebranded as candy sticks, stripped of their realistic packaging, or banned altogether in some states. By the 2000s, they had largely vanished from mainstream shelves. For those who grew up with them, candy cigarettes are remembered with a mix of fondness and unease. They were silly, harmless fun to a child, but now, they're a bittersweet reminder of just how deeply smoking culture shaped America's past. Right arrow, but while candy cigarettes mimicked something dangerous, our next banned treat was dangerous in itself. A snack so small and slippery, it became one of the most notorious foods ever pulled from American shelves. Sometimes, the most dangerous toys are the ones that seem the most innocent. And in suburban America, one backyard game blurred the line between fun and real danger. Lawn darts, better known by the brand name Jarts, were summertime staples starting in the late 1950s. The game was simple. Toss a heavy, steel-tipped dart across the yard and try to land it in a plastic ring. On paper, it was no different than horseshoes or bocce ball. But in practice, those darts weren't just toys. Each one was over a foot long, weighed nearly half a pound, and had a sharp metal point designed to stick in the ground. For adults, jarts were backyard fun, the kind of game you'd bring out a barbecue alongside the grill and a cooler of soda. But children, naturally curious, often joined in. And that's where the danger became impossible to ignore. Reports of serious injuries and even fatalities began stacking up throughout the 1970s and 80s. Parents who once laughed at the edgy toy began demanding action. By 1988, after years of lobbying and tragic accidents, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission finally banned jarts altogether. They were yanked off store shelves, and owning or selling them became illegal. For those who remember, jarts carry a strange nostalgia, a reminder of a time when toys were tougher, sharper, and sometimes reckless. They were a piece of carefree childhood that came with very real consequences. Right arrow, and while jarts were banned for being physically dangerous, our next banned item caused a different kind of panic, one born not in the backyard but on the dinner plate with a side of national controversy. Some foods are banned not because of what they do to us, but because of what we do to make them. Foie gras, a French delicacy made from the fattened liver of ducks or geese, has been part of gourmet cuisine for centuries. In high-end restaurants across Europe and America, it was seen as the ultimate luxury, rich, buttery, and unlike any other flavor. For decades, it carried a sense of elegance and exclusivity. But behind the delicacy was a darker story. To create foie gras, ducks and geese were force-fed through a process known as gavage, in which tubes delivered food directly into the animals' stomachs. Animal rights groups began exposing the practice in the 1980s and 90s, showing disturbing footage that shocked many Americans who had once enjoyed the dish without question. The backlash was swift. In 2006, Chicago became the first U.S. city to ban foie gras, sparking a heated national debate. Some argued it was an issue of cruelty. Others claimed the government had no place telling people what they could or couldn't eat. The controversy only grew when California followed suit, instituting a statewide ban that lasted for years. Even today, foie gras sits in a strange place in American history, both a banned product and a delicacy still sought after in select circles. For many, it represents the clash between old-world indulgence and modern ethical standards. It's a reminder that sometimes what we eat tells the world not just who we are, but what we're willing to accept. Right arrow, and while foie gras carried the weight of ethical debates, our next banned food wasn't fancy at all. In fact, it was a cheap, colorful treat that brought joy to kids until the government pulled the plug. Imagine walking into a candy store in the 1970s, reaching for a bag of M&Ms, and finding no red ones inside. For an entire decade, America's most iconic candy lost its most iconic color. In 1976, the FDA banned the use of red dye number 2, a synthetic coloring agent that had been linked, though never conclusively proven, to health risks, including cancer. The scare was so widespread that Mars, the company behind M&Ms, made the shocking decision to pull red M&Ms entirely, even though they didn't actually use red dye number 2 in their recipe. For years, Bags of M&Ms were filled with browns, yellows, and oranges, but no bright reds. For children growing up in the late 70s and early 80s, it felt like something was missing, the most vibrant and beloved color of them all. Red wasn't just candy. It was the flavor of Christmas stockings, Valentine's hearts, and birthday parties. Without it, the candy never felt quite complete. But that absence made the legend grow. Red M&Ms became almost mythical, whispered about by kids who swore they remembered them, while younger siblings couldn't believe they ever existed at all. Finally, in 1987, after public demand and years of testing new safe dyes, Mars brought red M&Ms back with great fanfare. It was a small change in candy, but for an entire generation, it symbolized how fear, science, and nostalgia can collide, and how sometimes, even the smallest things like a missing color leave the biggest mark on our memories. Right arrow, but while red M&Ms eventually made a comeback, our next banned candy was gone for good, pulled from shelves because it gave kids a little too much spark. What if your candy didn't just fizz, but actually sparked? For a short time in the 1970s, that was the thrill of sparklers, the candy that promised a literal explosion of fun in your mouth. Marketed as a high-energy novelty sweet, sparklers were designed to give kids the same excitement as Pop Rocks, but with an extra kick. Tiny crystals would crackle and sizzle on your tongue, producing a mild sparking sensation that felt dangerous. And that was the point. The packaging leaned into the thrill, showing bright, lightning bolts and fireworks, turning candy into something almost rebellious. But soon, parents grew uneasy. Rumors spread that sparklers weren't just fizzing, they were dangerous. Some claimed the candy could cause burns, while others worried that the explosive sensation was a choking hazard. Urban legends circulated about kids getting hurt, and while most of these stories were exaggerated, the fear was enough to get attention from regulators. By the early 1980s, sparklers were pulled from the market entirely. For children who had tried them, they became a badge of honor, a memory of tasting something forbidden, dangerous, and gone far too soon. Today, sparklers live mostly in memory and old candy ads, a strange relic of time when candy makers pushed the boundaries of what was safe fun. It's proof that sometimes the line between excitement and fear is just one spark away. Right arrow, but while sparklers vanished, another childhood treat disappeared for a very different reason. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was considered just a little too risky for young imaginations. Imagine being a kid in the 1950s, walking down the street with a candy stick hanging from your lips, pretending to be just like the grown-ups. Candy cigarettes gave children a taste of adulthood, and that's exactly why they were eventually banned. These simple chalky sugar sticks, sometimes wrapped in paper to look like real cigarette packs, were a huge hit with kids for decades. In the mid-20th century, smoking was not only common, it was fashionable. Movie stars smoked. Athletes smoked. Even doctors were featured in ads promoting cigarettes. So when kids reached for candy cigarettes, they weren't just eating sugar. They were imitating a cultural ritual that seemed cool, glamorous, and grown-up. But by the 1970s and 80s, the tide had turned. Public health campaigns were exposing the dangers of smoking, linking it directly to cancer and heart disease. Suddenly, candy cigarettes didn't look so innocent anymore. Critics argued that the candy was a gateway, teaching kids the gestures and glamour of smoking before they were old enough to understand the risks. Studies even suggested that children who ate candy cigarettes were more likely to smoke later in life. One by one, countries around the world banned candy cigarettes. In America, while not officially outlawed everywhere, they largely disappeared from shelves, replaced by rebranded candy sticks without the cigarette imagery. But for those who grew up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the memory lingers, sneaking a pack of candy cigarettes, blowing out little sugar dust like smoke, and feeling just a little bit rebellious. It was a treat that captured a moment in time, when even candy reflected America's complicated love affair with smoking. Right arrow, and while candy cigarettes faded because of health concerns, our next banned food disappeared for a much stranger reason. It contained something inside that made regulators nervous. For kids around the world, there was nothing more magical than cracking open a chocolate egg and finding a toy hidden inside. But in America, that same joy was considered too dangerous, and the beloved Kinder Surprise egg was banned for decades. Invented in the 1970s in Italy, Kinder Surprise eggs combined two things kids love most: chocolate and toys. The hollow chocolate shell contained a tiny plastic capsule with a toy that had to be assembled. Sometimes a figurine, sometimes a puzzle, sometimes even a miniature car. Across Europe, Asia, and South America, Kinder Eggs became a childhood tradition, sold in the billions each year. But in the United States, regulators saw things differently. The Food and Drug Administration, FDA, banned the candy under a 1938 law that prohibits embedding non-nutritive objects inside food. The worry was that a child might accidentally swallow the toy capsule, choke, or worse. So while kids in other countries grew up with the thrill of cracking open a Kinder Egg, American children had to listen to stories about them like they were contraband treasures from across the ocean. This only made them more mysterious. Families who traveled abroad often smuggled Kinder Eggs back as souvenirs. Some were confiscated by U.S. Customs. In fact, by the 2010s, thousands of Kinder Eggs were seized each year at the border. To many, it seemed absurd. You could buy fireworks or supersized sodas in America, but not a chocolate egg with a toy inside. Eventually, in 2017, Kinder released a workaround for the U.S. market. The Kinder Joy, where the toy was kept separate from the chocolate. But for nostalgia candy lovers, it was never quite the same. Kinder Eggs weren't just candy. They were an experience, a mix of surprise, sweetness, and childhood wonder. And for generations of Americans, it was the forbidden treat they never got to taste. Right arrow, and while Kinder Eggs were banned for safety, our next item disappeared for an entirely different reason. It was tied to America's most heated debates about politics and morality. Few foods symbolize luxury quite like foie gras, buttery, rich, and decadent. But behind the elegance of this French delicacy lies a controversy so heated that parts of America decided to ban it altogether. Foie gras, which translates to fatty liver, has been around for centuries, dating back to ancient Egypt. Farmers discovered that geese and ducks could be fattened by overfeeding, producing a silky, indulgent liver that became a prized delicacy in France. By the 20th century, foie gras was a status symbol, served in fine dining restaurants across Europe and America. But in the U.S., its popularity collided with changing cultural values. Animal rights groups began exposing the process of gavage, the force-feeding method used to enlarge the livers of ducks and geese. Videos of the practice shocked many Americans, sparking protests outside restaurants that served it. By the early 2000s, the debate had escalated into legislation. In 2006, Chicago became the first U.S. city to ban foie gras in restaurants, sparking national headlines. Just 2 years later, California went even further, passing a statewide ban on the production and sale of foie gras. Supporters of the ban called it a victory for animal welfare. Opponents, however, argued it was government overreach into personal choice and culinary tradition. The controversy even reached courtrooms, with lawsuits and appeals that dragged on for years. To this day, foie gras remains legal in much of the U.S., but its bans in certain states have made it one of the most famous and divisive foods ever restricted in American dining history. For some, foie gras was the ultimate symbol of fine dining. For others, it was cruelty on a plate. And in the end, this centuries-old delicacy became another food Americans could no longer freely enjoy. Right-arrow, but while foie gras faded due to ethical battles, our next banned foods weren't about luxury at all. They were the everyday snacks and treats that suddenly vanished from grocery store shelves. As we've seen, America's food story isn't just about what we eat, it's about what we've lost. From the candy bars that defined our childhoods, to the kitchen staples that disappeared overnight, to the delicacies that vanished under the weight of controversy. Each one tells us something about who we were and who we've become. These banned foods remind us of a time when the world felt a little different. A time when we didn't check ingredient labels, when commercials sang jingles we'll never forget, and when a trip to the corner store could mean discovering something new. But history has a funny way of repeating itself. Some of the foods we say goodbye to might one day return, reimagined, reformulated, or rediscovered. And others will live only in our memories, like a taste we can almost recall, but never quite experience again. The America we remember isn't just about products on shelves. It's about the emotions, the traditions, and the nostalgia they carried with them. Because sometimes, the taste of the past is sweeter than anything we have today. If you enjoyed this journey through America's forgotten and forbidden flavors, make sure to subscribe and join us next time as we continue to rediscover the foods places, and memories that shape the America we remember.